Nobody clapped when the deal closed. There was no champagne, no handshake for the cameras, no press release. Just a man in steel-toed boots signing papers at a folding table in the parking lot of a dead factory, while the wind blew rust dust across the concrete, and the bankers looked at him like he had lost his mind. The man's name was Gene Barlow. He was 44 years old, and he had just spent everything he had. Every dollar, every favor, every ounce of credibility he had built over 20 years to buy a steel mill that the entire industry had declared worthless. The purchase price was $1.8 million, which sounds like a lot of money until you understand that the mill had cost $40 million to build in 1962 and had been appraised at $22 million as recently as 1979. Gene Barlow had bought a $40 million facility for less than the price of the scrap metal inside it. The bankers thought he was crazy. The steel industry analysts thought he was crazy. His own wife, Linda, had looked at him across their kitchen table and said, "Gene, I have followed you through 20 years of midnight shifts and missed holidays and steel dust in every corner of this house. But this might be the one thing I cannot follow you through." Gene had looked at her and said, "Linda, I know this mill. I know every furnace, every ladle, every inch of floor. I know what is wrong with it, and I know how to fix it." She had stared at him for a long time. Then she said, "You better be right, because if you are wrong, we lose everything. Everything." He was not wrong, but proving it took a year that nearly killed him. This is the story of that year. Let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what Gene Barlow did, you need to understand where he came from and what he knew that the bankers and the analysts did not. Gene was born in 1942 in Weirton, West Virginia, a town that existed for one reason and one reason only: steel. His father, Earl Barlow, worked at the Weirton steel mill for 38 years. His grandfather, Thomas Barlow, had worked there before that. In Weirton, steel was not an industry. It was the air you breathed, the ground you walked on, the rhythm that organized your entire life. Earl Barlow was a furnace operator. He worked the open hearth, the hottest and most dangerous job in the mill. 12-hour shifts in front of a furnace that burned at 3,000 degrees, pouring molten steel that glowed white and moved like water made of light. Earl came home every night with burns on his arms and steel dust in his lungs, and he never once complained, because that was what men in Weirton did. They made steel, and they did not complain about it. Gene started working at the mill the summer he turned 16, sweeping floors, hauling scrap, doing the jobs that nobody else wanted. By the time he graduated high school, he knew he was not going to college. Not because he was not smart enough, he was plenty smart, but because the mill was in his blood the way farming is in a farmer's blood. It was not a choice, it was an identity. Over the next 20 years, Gene worked his way through every department in the mill. He operated furnaces. He ran the rolling mill. He worked maintenance, learning to fix the machines that broke down at 3 in the morning when no engineer was available and the production schedule did not care about your problem. He learned metallurgy on the job, figuring out why certain heats produced brittle steel and others produced steel you could bend without breaking. He learned costs, understanding which processes wasted money and which ones made it. By 1982, Gene was a shift supervisor at a small specialty steel mill in eastern Ohio. He was making $42,000 a year, which was good money for a man with no college degree. He had a house, a wife, 2 kids, and a reputation as the guy who could fix anything. If a furnace was running badly, Gene could walk up to it, listen for 30 seconds, and tell you what was wrong. If a heat was going sour, Gene could adjust the chemistry on the fly and save it. If a piece of equipment was down, Gene could have it running again before the maintenance crew finished their coffee. But 1982 was also the year the American steel industry began to collapse. Foreign competition, aging infrastructure, high labor costs, and bad management combined to create a catastrophe. Mills that had operated for decades began shutting down. Towns that had been built on steel watched their foundations crumble. Between 1979 and 1986, the American steel industry lost 350,000 jobs. Entire communities were destroyed. Gene watched it happen. He watched mills close in Youngstown, in Pittsburgh, in Bethlehem. He watched men he knew, men who had given their lives to steel, get handed pink slips and told that their skills were no longer needed. He watched towns die. And he noticed something that nobody else seemed to notice. The mills that were closing were not closing because steel was dead. Steel was not dead. The world needed more steel than ever. The mills were closing because they were being run by people who did not understand steel. Corporate executives with MBA degrees who had never set foot on a mill floor. Investment bankers who looked at a steel mill and saw numbers on a spreadsheet instead of a living, breathing operation that required knowledge and skill and experience to run properly. These men made decisions based on quarterly earnings reports and stock prices. They cut maintenance budgets to boost short-term profits, then acted surprised when the equipment broke down. They reduced quality controls to save money, then lost customers when the steel they shipped was not up to standard. They treated the workforce like an expense to be minimized, instead of an asset to be developed. Gene watched all of this, and a thought began to form in his mind. A dangerous thought. The kind of thought that keeps a man awake at night and makes his wife worry. What if I could do it better? The thought grew over the next 4 years. Gene studied, not in a classroom, but on the job and in his kitchen at night, with trade journals and financial statements spread across the table. He learned about mini-mills, a new model of steelmaking that used electric arc furnaces to melt scrap steel instead of the traditional blast furnace process. Mini-mills were smaller, cheaper to operate, more flexible. They could produce steel at a fraction of the cost of the big integrated mills. Gene also studied the failures. He visited closed mills, walked their silent floors, looked at their rusted equipment. He talked to the men who had worked there, the foremen and furnace operators and maintenance crews who knew exactly why their mills had failed. Knowledge that nobody in a corporate boardroom had ever bothered to ask for. By 1986, Gene had a plan. He was going to buy a dead mill and bring it back to life. The mill he found was in Ashland, Kentucky, on the south bank of the Big Sandy River. It had been built in 1962 by a company called River Valley Steel, a regional producer that had specialized in structural beams and plate steel for the construction industry. At its peak, the Ashland mill had employed 400 people and produced 200,000 tons of steel a year. River Valley Steel had gone bankrupt in 1984, a victim of the same forces that were killing mills all over the country. The parent company had stripped out everything valuable, sold off the inventory, and left the mill sitting empty. For 2 years, the building had been locked and abandoned, its equipment rusting, its parking lot empty, its smokestacks cold. The bank that held the mortgage wanted it gone. They had tried to sell it as a going concern. No buyers. They had tried to sell it for scrap. The scrap dealers said the demolition costs would eat up most of the scrap value. The mill was worth less than nothing on paper. It was a liability, a dead weight on the bank's books. Gene heard about the Ashland mill from a friend who worked at the bank. He drove down to look at it on a Saturday morning in September of 1986. What he saw would have discouraged anyone who did not know what they were looking at. The building was massive, 200,000 square feet of concrete and steel, dark and cold and silent. The equipment was rusted. The electric arc furnace, the heart of any mini-mill, had not been fired in 2 years. The rolling mill, the continuous caster, the crane systems, all of it sitting idle, covered in dust and oxide. But Gene did not see a dead mill. He saw a sleeping one. The equipment was old but solid. The furnace shell was intact. The transformers were serviceable. The rolling mill needed work, but was not beyond repair. The building itself was sound, built in the 1960s when people still built things to last. Gene spent 3 hours walking the mill floor. He climbed on equipment, opened panels, checked wiring, looked at bearings and gears and refractory linings. He did the same thing he had done with every piece of equipment he had ever encountered. He listened to it. Not with his ears, there was nothing to hear in a dead mill, but with his hands and his eyes and 20 years of experience that told him what could be saved and what could not. When he left the mill that afternoon, he knew 2 things. First, this mill could run again. Second, he was going to be the one to make it happen. Getting the money was the hardest part. Gene had about $180,000 in savings, the accumulation of 20 years of living below his means. That was enough for a down payment, but not enough to buy the mill and restart operations. He needed investment. Gene spent 4 months pitching his plan to anyone who would listen. Banks turned him down. They saw a man with no college degree and no business experience trying to buy a failed steel mill in a dying industry. Investment firms turned him down. The steel industry was toxic. Nobody wanted to put money into a sector that was hemorrhaging jobs and losing market share to foreign producers. Gene finally found his investors in the last place anyone would have expected. The workers, the men who had worked at the Ashland mill before it closed, the furnace operators, the rollers, the maintenance crews, the men who had been thrown out of work when River Valley Steel went bankrupt. Gene went to them with his plan. He told them what he wanted to do. He told them the risks, and he asked them to invest their severance pay, their savings, their unemployment insurance, whatever they could afford, in exchange for ownership shares in the new company. 47 men said yes. They put up a combined total of $620,000. Gene added his $180,000. A small regional bank that specialized in economic development loans contributed $1 million. The total was $1.8 million, barely enough to buy the mill and fund 3 months of restart operations. Gene named the company Heartland Steel. He signed the papers on a Tuesday morning in January of 1987. It was 14 degrees outside. The mill was unheated. The ink on the contract nearly froze before it dried. Now, let me tell you about the first year, because that year is where men are separated from dreamers. Gene moved into the mill. Not figuratively. Literally. He set up a cot in the former foreman's office and lived there for the first 6 months. He could not afford to waste time commuting. Every hour mattered. The first task was the furnace. The electric arc furnace was the heart of the operation. Without it, nothing else mattered. Gene and his crew spent the first 2 months rebuilding it. New refractory lining, new electrodes, rewired controls, rebuilt hydraulics. Gene did much of the work himself, crawling inside the furnace shell in the early morning hours, laying refractory brick the way his father had taught him, 1 brick at a time, each one placed precisely because a badly lined furnace was a dangerous furnace. The crew worked in conditions that would have violated every safety regulation in a corporate mill. The building was unheated. In January and February, the temperature inside the mill dropped below freezing. The men worked in heavy coats and gloves, their breath visible in the cold air, their fingers numb by mid-morning. There was no cafeteria, no break room, no amenities of any kind. They ate sandwiches sitting on equipment and drank coffee from thermoses they brought from home. Nobody complained. These were men who had been told their skills were worthless, that their industry was dead, that they should retrain for jobs in the service economy. They were steel workers, and they wanted to make steel. Gene had given them that chance, and they were not going to waste it. The furnace fired for the first time on March 14, 1987. Gene will never forget that date. He was standing at the control panel, his hand on the power switch, surrounded by the men who had invested everything in this moment. He flipped the switch. The electrodes descended into the charge of scrap steel. The arc struck with a sound like controlled thunder, a deep, violent roar that shook the building and lit the interior of the furnace with a light so bright it turned the viewing window white. The men cheered. Some of them had tears on their faces. They were making steel again. But firing the furnace was just the beginning. The steel had to be good. It had to meet specifications, pass quality tests, satisfy customers. This was where Gene's 20 years of experience became invaluable. The big mills relied on computers and chemical analysis labs to control their steel quality. Gene did not have computers. He did not have a lab. He had his eyes, his ears, and 2 decades of watching molten steel behave. He could look at the color of a heat and tell you the carbon content within 0.1%. He could listen to the furnace and tell you whether the chemistry was right. He could watch the steel pour and tell you if it would be strong or brittle, flexible or rigid. The first 3 months were brutal. Equipment broke down constantly. The rolling mill threw a bearing in the 2nd week and was down for 4 days while Gene and his maintenance crew fabricated a replacement. The continuous caster had alignment problems that took weeks to diagnose and fix. The crane systems were unreliable. The electrical infrastructure was aging. Gene fixed everything. He fixed it the way he had always fixed things, with knowledge, with patience, with the understanding that every machine has a personality, and you cannot fix what you do not understand. He slept 4 hours a night. He lost 20 pounds. Linda drove down from Ohio every weekend with food and clean clothes and the quiet support of a woman who had decided to trust her husband even when the odds said she should not. By June, Heartland Steel was producing 500 tons of steel a week. By August, they were at 1,000 tons. By October, they were running at full capacity, 4,000 tons a month, shipping structural beams and plate steel to construction companies across the Ohio Valley. The quality was exceptional. Gene's hands-on approach to steel making produced steel that was more consistent and more reliable than what the big mills were shipping. Customers noticed. Word spread. Orders came in faster than Gene could fill them. By December of 1987, 11 months after Gene had signed those papers in the frozen parking lot, Heartland Steel had revenue of $8.4 million and was operating at a profit. The 47 workers who had invested their savings were receiving paychecks and dividends. The regional bank was getting its loan payments on time, and Gene Barlow, the man with no college degree who had bought a worthless steel mill, was being written about in trade journals as the most improbable success story in American steel. But Gene was not finished. He was just getting started. Over the next 5 years, Gene reinvested every dollar of profit back into the mill. He bought a second electric arc furnace. He upgraded the rolling mill. He added a heat treatment facility. He hired more workers, always from the local community, always men and women who knew steel. By 1992, Heartland Steel employed 280 people and produced 300,000 tons of steel a year, 50% more than the original mill had ever produced. Revenue had grown to $60 million. The company was the largest employer in the county and one of the most profitable mini-mills in the country. The industry analysts who had called Gene crazy in 1987 were now calling him a genius. Business magazines ran profiles. Television crews showed up. The governor came to cut a ribbon when Gene opened his second facility. Gene tolerated the attention, but did not enjoy it. He was a steelworker, not a celebrity. He still wore steel-toed boots to work. He still walked the mill floor every day, checking equipment, talking to operators, listening to furnaces. He still knew every employee by name. When reporters asked him the secret of his success, Gene always gave the same answer. There is no secret. I just know steel. I know what it needs, and I know how to give it. The men in suits who ran the big mills, they knew finance. They knew stock prices. They knew how to cut costs on a spreadsheet. But they did not know steel. And you cannot make something you do not understand. What about the workers? Reporters would ask. They invested their savings. They took the same risk you did. That is because they understand something the bankers never will, Gene would say. A steel mill is not an investment. It is a community. It is 280 families who depend on each other. When the men invested their severance pay, they were not buying stock. They were buying their dignity back. They were saying, "We are steelworkers and we are not done." Let me tell you about what happened in 1995, because that is when the big money came calling. A major steel conglomerate, one of the largest in the country, approached Gene with an offer to buy Heartland Steel. The offer was $95 million. Gene Barlow, who had bought the mill for $1.8 million 8 years earlier, was being offered $95 million for it. The board of directors, which included representatives of the original 47 investors, met to discuss the offer. The numbers were staggering. The men who had invested $5,000 or $10,000 of their severance pay in 1987 would receive hundreds of thousands of dollars each. Gene himself would walk away with over $20 million. Gene listened to the discussion. He let everyone speak. Then he stood up and said something that nobody in the room expected. "I did not build this mill to sell it. I built it to prove that American steelworkers could compete with anyone in the world. If we sell to a conglomerate, what happens? They send in their MBAs. They cut costs. They reduce the workforce. They run this mill the same way they ran every other mill they have bought, into the ground. And in 5 years, these smokestacks will be cold again." He looked around the table at the men who had trusted him with their savings, their careers, their futures. "I know the money is tempting. It is tempting to me too. But money is not why we did this. We did this because everyone said we could not. Because the bankers said steel was dead. Because the analysts said a bunch of blue-collar workers could not run a business. We proved them wrong, and I am not ready to hand that proof over to the same kind of people who killed this industry in the first place." The vote was unanimous. They turned down the $95 million. Gene Barlow ran Heartland Steel for another 15 years. He expanded twice more, adding facilities in West Virginia and Indiana. By 2005, the company employed over 1,200 people and had annual revenue exceeding $400 million. Gene had turned a $1.8 million investment into a steel empire worth nearly $500 million. He finally stepped down as CEO in 2010, at the age of 68. He handed the company to his operations manager, a man named Curtis Webb, who had started at Heartland as a furnace operator in 1987, one of the original 47 investors. Curtis had worked his way up through the company the same way Gene had worked his way up through the industry, by knowing steel and never pretending to be something he was not. At Gene's retirement dinner, held in the mill cafeteria because Gene refused to have it anywhere else, Curtis stood up and said something that made the room go silent. Gene Barlow never called himself a businessman. He never called himself a CEO. He never called himself a billionaire, even after the accountants told him he was one. He called himself a steelworker. And that is the highest compliment I know how to give a man. Gene still lives in the house he bought in 1988, a modest 3-bedroom ranch in Ashland, 2 miles from the mill. He could have bought a mansion, He could have moved to any city in the country. A man worth what Gene is worth can live anywhere he wants. But Gene chose to stay in the same house, on the same street, in the same town, where he rebuilt an industry that the world had left for dead. Linda is still with him. The kitchen table where they discussed whether to risk everything is still the same table. The chairs are different. Linda replaced those in 2004 because she said a man could afford new kitchen chairs after 17 years. Gene did not argue. Gene drives to the mill once a week, not to work, but to walk the floor, to listen to the furnaces, to talk to the young operators who are learning the trade the same way he learned it, by doing it. He walks slowly now. His knees are not what they were, but his ears are still sharp. And when he hears something wrong in a furnace, he will stop, listen, and tell the nearest operator exactly what needs adjusting. The young ones look at him with a mixture of respect and disbelief. This old man in steel-toed boots, walking their floor, hearing things in the roar of the furnace that their instruments cannot detect. One of the young operators asked Gene once how he could hear the difference between a good heat and a bad one. Gene thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "My father taught me to listen, not to the sound itself, but to what the sound is telling you. A furnace talks to you if you know how to hear it. It tells you when it is happy and when it is struggling. It tells you when the chemistry is right and when something is off. You just have to pay attention." Most people do not pay attention. They look at gauges and readouts. Those are useful. But they are not the same as listening. Reporters still ask him the same question they have been asking for 30 years. How did a man with no degree, no business training, no connections, build a $500 million steel company from a dead mill that cost $1.8 million? Gene always gives the same answer. He gives it slowly, the way he does everything, with the patience of a man who has spent his whole life working with metal that cannot be rushed. Everyone thought the mill was worthless because it was closed, but closed is not dead. The equipment was still there. The knowledge was still there. The men who knew how to make steel were still there. The only thing that was missing was someone who believed it could work. I was not smarter than the men who ran the big mills. I was not luckier. I just knew something they did not know. I knew that the most valuable thing in any steel mill is not the furnace or the rolling mill or the building. It is the people, the men and women who understand the work, who feel the heat and read the metal and know in their bones when something is right and when something is wrong. The suits forgot that. They looked at spreadsheets and saw numbers. I looked at the mill floor and saw people. That is the only difference. And it made all the difference in the world. The Ashland mill is still running. The smokestacks are still hot. The furnaces still roar. And every morning, when the day shift walks through the gate, they pass a bronze plaque that Gene had installed in 1997. The plaque does not have his name on it. It does not mention the purchase price or the revenue or the empire he built. It says something simpler, something that means more. This mill was closed in 1984, and the world said steel was dead. In 1987, 47 steelworkers proved the world wrong. This plaque is dedicated to every man and woman who ever made steel with their hands and refused to believe that their work did not matter. That is the story of Gene Barlow and the worthless steel mill. The bankers laughed. The analysts shook their heads. The industry said it could not be done. And a man in steel-toed boots signed the papers, fired the furnace, and built an empire from the ashes. Not because he was special, because he knew what he was doing, and he never, not once, forgot where he came from. The bankers forgot. The analysts forgot. The suits in their corner offices forgot what steel was and who made it. Gene Barlow never forgot. And that made all the difference.